thank you so much for hopping on today. We had to bring you on because obviously we're seeing so many grandiose comparisons to the United States right now with our sort of operation in Iran. And one you're commonly seeing is people are tying it. They're saying, well, this is like the fall of Rome. Maybe America's overextending themselves. Maybe there's a lot of different interests that are colliding in Washington, and it's creating a really untenable situation. So we had to bring you on. We were having a conversation in the office, like who would be better? Who would be a more interesting guest to talk to than the great Jeremy Ryan Slate? So we had to bring you on. Can you give a quick intro of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I am the CEO of a company called Command Your Brand, and for the past decade, we've been helping our clients to be on the right podcasts out there. My master's is actually in early Roman Empire propaganda, and for the last decade, I've been talking about something I call the Roman pattern, the three things that cause civilizations to collapse: monetary debasement, immigration, and loss of ethics. So I think there's definitely a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess a good place to start maybe would just be, what do you think the Trump 2, specifically so the Trump second admin, where does this tie into? What does it remind you of? Because, I mean, I know a bit of Roman history, but I'm really still a novice, I would say, compared to even a lot of people in the space, and I hear people it's almost like a trope at this point where they compare us to Rome. But can you maybe break down specifically where we are at this moment and how this does tie in, or possibly where there actually is like a detachment as well?
Yeah, so I think the big struggle with it is when you look at history, and I'll say first off, I don't see myself as a historian. I definitely make mistakes. I'm not infallible, but I'm somebody that looks for patterns in history.
Yeah.
And when you look at Rome, people very often want to make the comparisons to Trump and Sulla, and a lot of what Sulla did after, the Marian reforms and Marius holds 7 consulships and whatever it might be. But honestly, I don't know that it's a direct translation. And I tend to look at, because if you look at Sulla's part of the Roman Republic, whereas the empire is kind of the later stage.
Sure.
And for America, I really look at us becoming an empire many, many years ago. I look at 1913 as a very pivotal year because there's 3 things that happened that year: the Federal Reserve, the 17th Amendment, which is actually something Tim's talked about quite a bit, where state legislatures are no longer selecting senators, are selected by popular vote. So the Senate and the House essentially do the same thing. And the other being the income tax amendment as well. So if you kind of look at that, we've been in a very much empire stage for a long time. So I don't know if there's a direct comparison empire-wise to what's happening with Trump 2. But if I've looked at a lot of the patterns that we see, that the thing that I do see is America, where it is now, is very similar to where Rome was in its 3rd century crisis. And in the 3rd century crisis, the thing we don't have is we don't have military commanders declaring themselves president and attacking each other.
Yeah.
But we do have a lot of the core components where they had inflation by 284s at 15,000%. They were no longer able to control their borders because there was so much infighting. And they were really in the downslide of an empire. So I do see some of those things with where we are now. But as I said, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme in a lot of ways.
Well, this is interesting because, typically when people talk about, Rome sort of going from republic to empire, they often point to this moment. They say now is the moment where America is shifting from a republic into a full-fledged empire. Maybe this occurred in the last 20, 30 years. So that's really interesting that you point back to the early 20th century as that moment where that occurred. I guess because people look at the pure sort of just the post-Cold War, like unipolar moment that we were in, and they maybe point to that as why this is truly the moment we became this all-encompassing empire. But that's fascinating.
I look at executive power as kind of the main reason I'm looking at that, because if you look at the way America's set up, we're supposed to have 3 co-equal branches of government. But if you look at since Woodrow Wilson and later FDR is even bigger than that, the executive positions continued to centralize and centralize and centralize. And if you look at even Trump, you look at Biden, you look at Obama, and even Bush, they're mainly ruling by executive order, which, as much as I liked a lot of what Trump did and tried to do in the first term and some of what he's tried to do here, I don't love that he's ruling by executive order, because that's not how the government's supposed to function. It is very much more of an emperor type role compared to an executive type role.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the point I made in the opening monologue regarding, John Thune holding up the SAVE Act and just conducting affairs just really sloppily. And I'm like, I'm a huge Trump shill, quite frankly. But seeing we're in this stage where I'm like, if a Democrat, God forbid, were to win in 28, a good chunk of the Trump agenda gets rolled up within a few months because a lot of this just is not being codified by the Republican majority.
Correct.
And it's very unfortunate. So I totally agree with what you're saying.
And that's the problem you get is each administration rolls back the dictates of the previous administration because there's no actually law holding it in place. And,
Right.
and that does become a real problem.
And I've heard people compare this. They were saying this happened in Rome where you got to this point where it's very unstable, where you just had emperors and leaders broadly across the empire just contradicting their predecessor, power struggles, these sorts of things. And it just became very unclear to the population, what direction is this actually going? How agile can we even be as far as policy making, as far as conquest and these sorts of things? Is that true? Is there any similarity?
There's definitely truth to that. The thing I'll say is, as I said, it's not a direct comparison
Sure.
because the issue you see in the 3rd century is you see emperors that are basically military commanders deciding they're an emperor, raising an army, attacking someone else, and declaring themselves emperor. So from 235 to 284, you have at least, and there's likely more from some of the coinage they've started finding, but at least 26 different emperors in that time period of about 50 years.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of turnover, and what it becomes is it's not who has the most political power, who has the most qualifications for the job, but it's whoever has the biggest army. And that does start to become a problem. Now, as I said, we don't really see that now,
Sure.
but we do see the way, even with the groups like Antifa and a lot of the rioting and things that we see on the ground, there is a lot of political fractioning right now. It is something that's definitely happening. But if you want to go even earlier, even Edward Gibbon in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire says if you wanted to look at kind of the most prosperous time to live, it's during what's called the time of the 5 good emperors. And the thing that's different about those 5s, that starts in 96 with Nerva, so it's Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who's the last one. And Aurelius breaks that and names his son Commodus to be the next emperor. The thing that they did is they chose the best politically qualified person to be the next emperor rather than their son, because it kind of gives you a mixed bag of emperors.
Yeah.
And that the rule of Commodus is what Gibbon says takes the empire and takes it from one of marble to one of steel and rust. Because the rule of Commodus that ends in 192, it's what's called the year of the 5 emperors, and the last one that comes out of it is a guy named Septimius Severus, and he's a general, and he basically attacks Rome, declares himself emperor, removes the Praetorian Guard, puts in a new Praetorian Guard, and that model is going to be what every emperor after that point is going to use to get power. Raise a military, double their pay, give them, more things than you could imagine, and it's what's going to really fuel inflation a lot faster. So it is, though it's not a direct comparison, it does show kind of how power starts to disintegrate, and nobody really knows who's, number one, who's in charge, but number two, what are the actual laws, because these emperors are changing so fast.
This is so fast. There's so many different directions we could go here. I guess the primary one, I guess we should still hit on, because I was saying, sometimes you hear these and they almost seem like cliches. It's kind of hard to parse through what's actually a true comparison, what's not. One that I commonly hear that you'll see, publicized quite extensively on like Twitter or Facebook or these sorts of places, is they talk about, the migration in Rome and how Rome increasingly became less Roman. And then obviously as a one-to-one with basically every country in the West, specifically the United States. And then two, I don't know if this one is, I don't know how accurate this one is, but they often refer to sort of a similar welfare arrangement where they talk about that there was sort of a grain subsidy that was provided for a lot of citizens in Rome in the later years. And that one I don't know as much about, so that's why I wanted to ask you.
Well,
because
I
I've
can
heard
help
this.
you with both of those.
Yeah.
So the grain dole actually starts after 133. So there's 2 brothers, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. Gaius Gracchus had fought in the Punic Wars, and when they're over, he's on his way back to Rome, and he's kind of seeing a lot of the desolation in the countryside as he's coming back to Rome. So one of the things he does is he institutes the grain roll when he becomes tribune of the plebs. And he's actually going to be assassinated by being beat to death in the Senate chamber with the stool of a chair.
Oh.
And this grain dole, though, it starts with him and it's going to continue. And actually, Julius Caesar, when he becomes dictator for life in 46 BC, one of the main things he's going to do is actually take this grain dole and systemize it. So it becomes a lot easier to actually give it out to people. So all citizens were guaranteed a certain amount of grain. And actually, one of the most powerful men in Rome was the man in charge of the grain supply. So that's going to continue to become a problem for Rome, because one of the reasons that Rome is able to rise like it is something called the Roman climate optimum. They basically had perfect weather from about 200 BC to around 200 AD.
Yeah.
So because of that, there's a lot more of an ability to feed people. Now, around the 250s, they're going to be experiencing climate change. And the emperor during that time, Decius, is dealing with barbarians on the borders, climate change, and he says the best solution is to force people to sacrifice the gods and persecute Christians. He's trying to restore what's called the peace of the gods, hoping that climate change will end and the barbarians will leave them alone. Now, obviously, that doesn't work, but you're going to see grain prices doubling, quadrupling. They're going to continue to go up. So now this need to feed all of these people becomes a whole lot harder. And if you want to go a little bit earlier, into 212 AD, Emperor Caracalla is trying to basically get money back into the purse because he spent a lot of Rome's money. So he issues an edict and gives 30 million free people citizenship overnight. Now, that also would have given them access to the grain dole in addition to what he was trying to get, which was the ability to tax them, because their tax percentage would have went from 5% to 10% by becoming citizens. So you're going to see that grain dole cost now continue to go up. So that is something that feeding the Roman people becomes a very, very expensive thing to have. What was the other question you had? I apologize.
It was relating to migration and sort of the impacts it had on Roman society.
Yeah, so that's a really difficult question. And I know this is something, there's a long thread between Elon and Roman Helmet Guy. I don't know if you've seen this on X. That was quite interesting.
Yeah.
And the issue of what is Romanness is something that's often been debated, because Rome is very cosmopolitan in a lot of ways and has been so for a long time. You have a lot of the early Italians, when you're looking at the early Republic, that you would say, well, they're Roman. But then Rome, one of the reasons it's able to expand in the Republic is they don't, when they conquer places, they say, give us soldiers, not taxes early on. So Rome starts to expand through bringing in armies to actually serve for Rome. And they would allow a lot of the wealthier classes in those areas to have Roman citizenship and rule the area for Rome. So what is Romanness is something that is hard to debate, because it does continue to get watered down as Rome becomes more cosmopolitan. Now, the thing I'll say is you have these migrations that happen in the 3rd and 4th century from barbarians coming into Roman land. But one of the things that precedes this is in the 160s, you have what's called the Antonine Plague. And about 10% is kind of the low end of this, of the empire actually dies. They think it's smallpox. They're not really sure. So the population starts to contract because they have that plague. And then if you go into the 250s, they have another plague called the Cyprian plague. So the population is collapsing from illness, in addition to barbarians being brought into the empire. So it does become a longer term problem. And if you look at how Rome, quote unquote, falls, it's kind of more of a fade out than a fall, as kind of the Roman elite become barbarian elite and kind of inherit the same system.
That seems to be where people then tie into the United States the most, right? Is like the fall, the turnover from Roman elite. Because I mean, America, I'm an advocate of sort of this heritage American sort of label. I think it's very useful, and I think it's going to help us sort of consolidate policy. That being said, I can concede that the American identity still is a bit complicated, right? It's not just like 100% English or 100% French. Like there's a little more to it. And it does evolve over time. You see this throughout the United States. It does evolve. It does expand. You have other groups that are also distinctly American that are within the the borders of the United States. That's where then again you start to see those comparisons to Rome. Is okay, you see the churn of identifiably American elite into identifiably foreign elite. Again, there's sort of foreign interests in the United States that wield quite a bit of power. These sorts of things. And that's where you do start to see people make that comparison to the fall of Rome. And in the same, I think people always see that famous painting and they imagine, the fall of Rome must have been like a day. But to your point, like they kind of went out with a whimper over time. And sort of it seems like that's how country, like now you don't really see liberal democracies collapse. That doesn't really happen.
Yeah.
Like South Africa should have collapsed by now and they haven't. It's like they just kind of slowly fade and kind of whimper as they go out. So all this to be said, I mean, are those comparisons fair?
I think that comparison's very fair, and I know Tim's actually talked about this on IRL a number of times. Where if you look at like the American Revolution as a great example, it's not a 1 year or 2 year event. It's
Sure.
generations. It takes decades to actually get to that moment. And I think when we write history, we write it in postscript.
Yeah.
We can see that important day. We can see what happened there, and we say, well, that's an important day. But for somebody that lived before the day or after the day, they're a regular person, their life wouldn't have been that much different.
Yeah.
But I think if you're looking at patterns and indicators in the 3rd century, one of the things you start to see is Rome makes agreements with barbarians that had been living on the borders and in the borders, what are called the federati. And what they would do is they would get sustenance and money from Rome to protect the borders. What starts to happen is as these emperors are raising armies and fighting each other, they start to care less about those borders, and they start to break their agreements with those federati on the Roman borders. So then they start living within Roman territory, not under Roman law, and within their own enclaves. And I think that's a really interesting comparison to now, because as people have less identifiable, I guess, Romanness or Americanness in a lot of different ways. And the reason that they're in your place really is for your currency.
Yeah.
As your currency starts to collapse, well, what do they have allegiance to? And I think that's the real problem you have to look at. Because if your currency is collapsing, and if you look at inflation over the last 100 years, it really is insane. And as I mentioned, in the 280s, Rome's at 15,000% inflation. So as that currency starts to lack value, the people that are there for the currency, well, they're not going to care about that country anymore, because the currency is the reason they're there, right? So I think that's the real concern to me, as people start to kind of form their own enclaves and not really want to be part of the system, right? Because if you look at Rome being a cosmopolitan empire for the first 200 to 300 years worked really well, because people wanted to be a part of the system. They valued citizenship. They valued the currency. But as those things start to disappear, well, you don't really need the empire anymore. And I think that's the problem you start to see as the downslide of an empire occurs.
Oh, that's so eerie. That really is very, very eerie. Was there, as far as we can tell, was there awareness among the Roman elite, or maybe even just the Roman public broadly at the time, that this was sort of the slow-moving disaster that that eventually unfolded, or were they kind of asleep at the wheel? Because that's kind of the situation now in America, where it seems like the majority of the population kind of understands there's something wrong, and if they can't quite articulate it, but among the public, among the elite, like, it's still taking a bit of time to fully wake people up to this issue, what's going on, connecting all the dots. I mean, Trump obviously does indicate that the majority, maybe it's tipped over into like, yes, this is a problem. Was there any sense of that in Rome at the time, like, or was it?
Well, I think for regular people, you're going to start to see that in the marketplace, because one of the problems you have is the currency is going to collapse. You have the black market starts to rise, and people actually start trading on regular base metals, because they know that coin doesn't have the percentage of gold they were telling you it had, or the percentage of silver that it had. And they know, well, I can trade this number of horses for this number of sheep, and that's fair. So you do start to see that among regular people, where a black market's going to rise. And in the 280s and 290s, one of the things that Diocletian does as part of his reforms is he actually creates price controls. And it doesn't work really well, and it actually fuels the black market even more, because people realize those coins aren't really paying for much.
Right.
So that is something you see as the rise of a black market to kind of fund the regular people. Now, the elites, the problem is, and I think this is the most direct comparison to our elites now, they're just playing musical chairs for whoever's in power now or whoever's going to be in power next. And I think you look at the way history is written, you can go even earlier to the time of Nero. Well, people writing during Nero's life loved him, but people that wrote after his life hated him, right? Because he's no longer here. He's no longer a threat. And I think that's what you have to look at, is the elites are really oblivious and just grasping for power. And that's why I look at ethics being a major issue, because they start to care less about the future and more about what's power now, what's going to get me money now, and how am I doing in the moment. And I think a really good example of this is in the late 3rd century, in the 270s, Rome actually breaks into 3 empires. It breaks into the Gallic Empire in the west, the Central Roman Empire, which is kind of hollowed out, and then the Palmyrene Empire in the east. And then there's a man named Aurelian in 274 that reconquers the west, reconquers the east, puts it all back together, and then his reward is being assassinated. So this is the issue you start to have, is you don't have consistent power by men that actually deserve to be there.
Oh my gosh. It is eerie. It is eerie. This is something interesting. I don't know if it's a LARP. I'm curious what you think, if this is a LARP or not. But there's people that will make the case that America is Rome, and it is Rome on purpose. Like the founders had the foresight to arrange our nation in so far as it would become sort of the new Rome in a lot of ways. And then people start to connect that metaphysically. I don't know how like deep you get on these sort of topics, but like you said, history, it rhymes, right? It rhymes, there's patterns, these sorts of things. I guess my question would be, our founders, I mean, obviously they're more well-read than probably the overwhelming majority of Americans today. Were they really like that keen on sort of recreating the conditions of early Rome, or was that just kind of more like a theme among other themes?
Yeah, I don't know if that's really the case, and because if you look at it, what our founders were trying to do and the way they were trying to do it is they took the best parts of democracy, the best parts of republicanism, and the best parts of monarchy to try and make our system, right? Because there are benefits to each individual system. So I think they would be looking at that, and I'm trying to remember offhand, I think it was Plato that has a theory of political systems and how they break down. And I think if you look at that, it's a really good description of kind of where we're going and how things are going, because we're not really a functional republic in a lot of ways anymore.
Sure.
And democracies can generally become tyrannical eventually, because you look at even what happened to Athens during the time of the tyrants of Athens. Eventually it goes from, this democracy, which is actually lasts a very short period of time, and it just becomes a strong man running a nation. So I when I look at that, I don't know that our founders were necessarily trying to rebuild Rome, because even the Roman Republic, you have about 10% literacy, and it's run by about those same 10%. So most people wouldn't have actually had a ton of political power. So, and for them transitioning to a republic to an empire, their life wouldn't have been that much different. It just would have been a new guy in charge. So I think when our founders are looking at it, they were trying to take the best aspects of different systems and trying to make something that could work better and a little bit longer. But once again, if our Constitution isn't used and doesn't function in the way it was written, as we've kind of seen over the last 100 years, it does become really hard to maintain that system.
That's faster. So in the Roman homeland, what does it look like for the citizenry as a vacuum begins to form, right? As Rome really begins to fall? Again, obviously this took, a few generations, but what were the dramatic differences in the lives of someone that lived, I guess you would say modern Italy especially, but, certainly like, core Roman territory. What did that look like? What came about afterwards? Obviously, everyone knows that like there kind of was a retraction in human development and these sorts of things. Could you maybe elaborate on that? And because that's obviously what a lot of people fear. A lot of people have a difficulty even imagining what the world would look like without the United States, or at least like a sort of neutered version of the United States.
Well, I think it's the hard part is, and this is something a lot of Roman historians talk about, is the thing that we're missing is we have to surmise how regular people were doing and feeling. There isn't a ton of how were regular people feeling. It was pretty much elites writing about how it's pretty much elites writing about how elites are doing. And at the same time, because of power changes, a lot of sources have been lost. And also because of what they were written on, a lot of sources have been lost. So the thing you have to look at is actually structurally what happens. 476 is kind of the date that's given for when the Western Empire falls. And you get in a lot of heat if you say Rome fell in 476, because the Byzantine Empire only gets that name in the 16th century. They consider themselves to be Romans, and a lot of historians will say, well, Rome fell in 1453 to the Ottomans, because it is, though the system becomes different, it is still Roman and there was still an emperor.
Sure.
And Charlemagne rising in 800 to them would have been like, who's this guy? I don't understand. Now, if you look at the Western Empire and kind of that period of the fall, you have to look at how that happens. What ends up happening is in 476, there's a barbarian king, because over the last 100 years, barbarian commanders had pretty much been running the emperors that were in there. They were like figureheads. There's a child named Romulus Augustulus. He's a teenage emperor. And there's a barbarian commander named Odoacer that actually retires him, gives him a pension, doesn't kill him, sends him to Ravenna to live. And that is the last emperor of Western Rome. Odoacer becomes the first king of Rome, and he's followed not too long after that by Theodoric. But what happens is it starts to break up into smaller individualized kingdoms because there is no real central power anymore. Power becomes local. So I think if you want to look at what would happen if a nation state collapsed, or if something like America collapsed, it becomes more individualized and local. And the problem you are going to have on that is you will start to have problems with your neighbors, right? Because the thing that does benefit us as America with a federal system, we're much stronger together for international relations than we are as individual states. And that would be a real problem we would have. So standard of living would change dramatically because your money isn't the money being used anymore. Your power as a body that's combined doesn't exist anymore. And I think that would be the real problem that people would be struggling with is, your state I live in New Jersey, our state of New Jersey would not be very powerful compared to like a state of California that just has more people and more size.
Yeah.
So those are things you would really have to look at as something starts to disintegrate.
Okay. That's so nervy because everyone's talking about the balkanization of the United States, and a lot of people are like excited for it, and I'm like, that just completely neuters us. And I like internationally, the entire system would shift because, I mean, I've been on the show. I've been slightly, I'm not as eager to declare China as like this preeminent superpower. I think increasingly we're seeing cracks, but I do think if a vacuum were to form in the next 10 years, they're obviously positioned quite well. So it'd be more of just a changing of the guard. I had, I guess, one more question because
Sure.
we have a little bit more time. I'm curious, going back into antiquity, if there was a war where Rome, later on truly overextended themselves, because this is obviously Trump is the hot hand right now with all of his operations. There seemingly is no blowback, but a lot of people are saying Iran is clearly different. Is there an example in Roman history of a war where Rome truly overextended itself and it had massive ramifications for the elite back home?
What would you say if I said it was the Persians again?
I wouldn't be surprised, I guess.
Well, so if you look at kind of the late Republic, the mid to late Republic, Rome has the Punic Wars with Carthage. There's 3 of them, but that's actually one of the things that allows Rome to become an empire and allows them to become more militarized. So in a lot of ways, it's actually more beneficial to Rome. But if you look at Persia is a long-term problem for the Romans, and they're going to have various conflicts ongoing. The first one they're going to have a problem with is the Parthians, and they're going to have problems with them on and off. But in the 3rd century, you're going to have a guy named Ardashir I that creates a new dynasty called the Sassanids. So he's going to conquer Parthia, become the new Persian leader in the Sassanid dynasty. His son, Shapur I, is much more militant than him, much stronger, and he's going to start having incursions with Rome. And this is during the 3rd century when Rome's dealing with inflation, so they already have a monetary problem. They're really struggling with their borders, so they don't really have a ton of power there. And the cohesiveness of who's in control of this empire is really difficult because it's about 4 emperors into the crisis of the 3rd century. It's actually, he's dealing with an emperor named Gordian III, who the 2 before him, Gordian I and Gordian II, last a few months and they're killed. So Shapur has a short battle with Gordian. Gordian's actually killed by his own men during the battle. The guy that takes over for him is named Philip the Arab. So Philip the Arab comes to an agreement with Shapur, basically pays him off, and the Sassanids leave him alone for a while. This is in the 240s, I think, offhand. As you get to the 260s, the Sassanids are going to invade again with Shapur, and they come up against a emperor named Valerian, and this is one of the ultimate embarrassments from Rome. And there's actually a statue of this, I believe, in Tehran, of this moment. And that is when Shapur I actually captures Valerian. It's the first Roman emperor to ever be captured, uses him as a footstool the rest of his life. And it's the first time a Roman emperor actually falls to a foreign commander like this. And there's actually a statue of this, of Shapur using Valerian as his footstool in Tehran. The Persians are still quite proud of this moment. So it's not something that causes Rome to collapse, but it hits Rome during this moment when they're already dealing with these other problems. And not long after that is when the Gallic Empire is going to break off and the Palmyrene Empire is going to break off because now Rome is so much weaker. So in a moment like that, you can see fracturing start to happen.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, I got to look up the statue. I mean, I'll throw it up in post. I could probably throw a picture up or something. That's fascinating. I did not know that. Well, Jeremy.
It was in popular culture. I think about 2 weeks ago they were talking about it, and it was kind of all over X.
Yeah, I remember seeing a little bit of the discourse, but I hadn't quite fleshed out like what exactly went down. That's amazing. That's so. Jeremy, this has been like super fascinating. We got to have you back on here soon.
Yeah.
Maybe as the war develops, you can say maybe footstool is imminent. Who knows? But yeah.
And like I said, history does rhyme; it doesn't repeat. But I don't know that you're going to see a moment like that. But I think to see that power structure in a moment when an empire is already weak from immigration and inflationary issues, it doesn't bode well for the future.
Jeez. Oh man. All right. Well, Jeremy, thank you very much for hopping on. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you for more? They're going to want more.
Yeah, so I'm at Jeremy Ryan Slate everywhere. My company is commandyourbrand.com. I also have 2 YouTube channels. Hidden Forces in History is the first, where we look at kind of the forces behind history, and the other is called The Roman Pattern, where we look at how civilizations collapse using Rome as a pattern.
Fascinating. I love your content already, and now I'm going to be like tonight when I get home, just completely devouring everything. So thank you so much for hopping on. We'll catch you next time.
All right, thanks.
All right. Well, that was the great Jeremy Ryan. That was awesome. He is goated. There's no question about it. So we got to wind things down. I wanted to talk to him for like 3 hours, but freaking Rumble's like longhousing me and making me leave and turn the freaking stream off. So super gay that I can't stream for like 20 hours just in a row and just talk to Jeremy. But it's whatever. We'll bring him back on soon. Thank you very much for watching. Andrew, thank you for holding it down today. Where can people find you? A_Minx. Go give Andrew a follow. If you're not following him, then that's just on you at this point. You're just asking for an inferior life experience. So with that, follow me on X and Instagram at Real Tate Brown. Come give me a follow. Make sure you follow Jeremy. Make sure you follow Andrew. And we'll be back tonight for Tim Cast IRL at 8 p.m. I will see you guys there. Thank you very much for watching.